Insults and harsh reprimands had become a daily routine at Harbor Delhi. But today, everything was about to change. When a hard-working black waitress was humiliated in front of customers by a ruthless manager, she did what she always did. She swallowed the pain and kept working. It seemed like just another day in her personal hell, until suddenly, a man stood up. He carried himself with quiet authority, moving slowly toward the manager. And when he revealed who he really was, the entire cafe shifted. Power changed hands and nothing would ever be the same again. It was a chilly autumn morning in Chicago, and the streets were already alive with the rhythmic sounds of the city waking up. The golden light of the rising sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk, reflecting off the large glass windows of Harbor Delhi, a small but bustling breakfast cafe nestled between towering office buildings. The scent of fresh bread, sizzling bacon, and rich coffee filled the air, luring in early morning workers, college students, and retirees looking for their daily dose of warmth before facing the day ahead. Inside the cafe, Naomi Carter, a 34-year-old single mother, moved with quiet efficiency behind the counter. She had been working here for 4 years, ever since her husband walked out on her and their then 4-year-old daughter, Amari. Life had never been easy, but Naomi had learned to carry the weight of her struggles with grace. She worked tirelessly, balancing long shifts with raising her daughter, doing her best to ensure Amari never felt the absence of a father. No matter how exhausted she was, she always had a soft smile for customers, a patient word for her coworkers, and a quiet resilience that made her stand out, even if no one seemed to notice. Harbor Delhi was already filling up with the usual morning crowd. Businessmen in crisp suits tapped away at their laptops, a group of college students huddled in the corner, chatting over overpriced lattes, and an elderly couple shared a plate of toast in comfortable silence. The hum of conversation blended with the clinking of dishes and the hiss of the espresso machine, creating a familiar symphony of the breakfast rush. Naomi wasn't alone in handling the chaos. Lisa, a 19-year-old college student working part-time, darted between tables with a notepad in hand, her movements clumsy but eager. She had only been working at the cafe for a month and was still learning the ropes, her hands sometimes trembling when customers barked their orders at her. Then there was David, 21, new to the job, with a quiet demeanor and an earnest desire to get things right, even if his slow pace sometimes frustrated the more impatient customers. Both Lisa and David looked up to Naomi, not just because she was more experienced, but because she was the only person willing to guide them without judgment. She had a way of stepping in when they fumbled, correcting their mistakes without making them feel small. More often than not, when their manager, Victor Barnes, was in one of his moods, Naomi would take the blame for their slip-ups, shielding them from his harsh words. Victor was a man in his late 40s with a perpetually sour expression and a voice that carried across the cafe like a gavel slamming down on a courtroom bench. He ruled over his small domain with an iron fist, barking orders, scrutinizing every movement, and making sure everyone knew who was in charge. He especially had a habit of picking on Naomi not because she was incompetent, but because he knew she wouldn't fight back. To him, she was just another disposable worker, someone who wouldn't dare to challenge his authority. This morning was no different. The rush had just begun, and orders were coming in faster than the small team could handle. Lisa, caught up in the whirlwind of activity, mistakenly delivered the wrong order to a middle-aged businessman seated near the window. The man, wearing an expensive navy blue suit and a gold watch, frowned at the plate in front of him, as if someone had just served him roadkill. "I didn't order this," he said, his voice laced with irritation. Lisa's eyes widened in panic. I'm so sorry, sir. I'll fix it right away." Before she could retreat to the kitchen, Victor swooped in like a hawk spotting its prey. "For God's sake, Lisa, how hard is it to read an order?" he snapped, his voice loud enough for half the cafe to hear. "You've been here a month, and you're still screwing up. If you can't handle a simple job, maybe you shouldn't have one." Lisa froze, her face turning red, her fingers trembling as she clutched her notepad. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly not expecting such an outburst over something so minor. A few customers turned to watch, some whispering among themselves. David, standing behind the counter, looked down at the floor, as if hoping not to be next in line for Victor's wrath. Naomi saw the distress in Lisa's eyes and stepped forward without hesitation. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for the mistake," she said, her voice calm and measured, as she gently took the incorrect plate from the table. "Let me get your correct order right away." Then she turned to Victor, her tone respectful but firm. "It was my fault. I should have reminded Lisa to double-check the order before bringing it out." Victor turned his sharp gaze on her, his lips curling in disdain. "Oh, of course," he scoffed. "Always so quick to take the blame, aren't you, Naomi? Always playing savior to these kids who should know better." Naomi kept her expression neutral, though her stomach twisted. She knew where this was going. Victor never missed a chance to belittle her. "You know what your problem is?" he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're so busy mothering everyone here, you forget this is a job, not a daycare. No wonder your life is a mess. Maybe if you weren't so distracted, you wouldn't be stuck in a dead-end job." A heavy silence settled over the cafe. Lisa looked mortified, her eyes darting between Naomi and Victor. David's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw tight. The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, now fully regretting drawing attention to himself. But Victor wasn't done. His eyes gleamed with something cruel, and the next words out of his mouth felt like a blade cutting through Naomi's chest. "You can't even train a couple of clueless kids, and you expect me to believe you're raising a child on your own. Face it, Naomi, if you can't handle your job, what makes you think you can handle being a mother? No father around, no real family structure, let me guess. Your kid's probably running wild just like you." He chuckled bitterly. "Without a father, she doesn't stand a chance. She'll end up just like you, barely scraping by, waiting for someone to save her." The words hit Naomi like a freight train. Her heart pounded in her chest, her throat tightening, but she willed herself to stay composed. She refused to let him see the pain he had just inflicted. She should have spoken up. She should have defended herself, her daughter. But what could she say? She needed this job. If she lost it, how would she keep paying rent? How would she put food on the table? The unfairness of it all weighed heavy on her, but she forced herself to swallow it down. Across the cafe, sitting quietly at a corner booth, a man who had been watching everything unfold set down his coffee cup. His dark brown eyes, sharp with intelligence, narrowed slightly as he observed the interaction. Unlike the other customers, he wasn't just an onlooker feeling second-hand discomfort. He was Jordan Mitchell, and what no one in this room knew, what even Victor had no idea about, was that Jordan wasn't just any customer. He was the CEO of Harbor Deli. Naomi forced a swallow, her pulse pounding in her ears as Victor's words hung in the air like a stench no amount of fresh baked bread or coffee could mask. She could feel every pair of eyes in the cafe on her, some filled with pity, others merely uncomfortable, choosing to remain silent rather than intervene. Lisa stood frozen beside her, her lower lip trembling, her hands clenched into tight fists. David, still behind the counter, had gone rigid, his jaw tight with barely contained frustration. But no one spoke. No one challenged Victor. No one ever did. Naomi had been here before. Different words, different settings. Same feeling. The deep, humiliating sting of being made to feel small, as if her struggles were a flaw, as if being a single mother made her lesser. She had learned to take it, to swallow it down, to let it roll off her shoulders and keep going. She had rent to pay. A daughter to raise. The last thing she could afford was losing her job over pride. But today, something was different. As she gripped the tray in her hands, steadying herself, something in the corner of her vision caught her attention. A man, tall, dark-skinned, well-dressed but not in the flashy way of a businessman, trying to show off, more like someone who carried quiet authority. He had been sitting in the corner for a while, unnoticed, sipping his coffee, observing. Now he wasn't just observing, he was watching. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, locked onto Victor with an intensity that sent a flicker of uncertainty across the manager's face. Naomi didn't know who he was, but something about the way he held himself, the calm in his posture, the unreadable expression made it clear he wasn't just another customer. Victor, still basking in the power of his own cruelty, either didn't notice or didn't care. He exhaled sharply and shook his head, a look of exaggerated disappointment crossing his face. "That's the problem with people like you," he muttered, his voice low but pointed. "Always looking for excuses. Always expecting sympathy. But the world doesn't work like that, Naomi. Nobody's coming to save you." A flicker of anger stirred in Naomi's chest, But before she could even think of how to respond, a deep, measured voice cut through the room like a knife. "Excuse me." The cafe went silent. The customers, already pretending not to listen, fully turned their heads now. Lisa took a step back, eyes wide. Victor stiffened slightly, caught off guard by the unexpected interruption. The man in the corner stood up, setting his coffee cup down with deliberate slowness. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket, his movements smooth, precise, controlled. Then he walked forward, closing the distance between himself and Victor with the kind of confidence that came from a man used to being in charge. Naomi held her breath as the stranger stopped just a few feet from them. His expression remained neutral, unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet authority that didn't need to be announced to be recognized. Victor cleared his throat, straightening his posture. "Can I help you?" The man studied him for a second before speaking, his tone calm, even, but laced with something unmistakable power. "I'd like to speak to your manager." Victor let out a small scoff, crossing his arms over his chest. "You're looking at him." The man nodded slightly, as if filing the information away. Then he glanced briefly at Naomi, his gaze lingering on her for just a second before he returned his attention to Victor. "Good," he said smoothly. "Then you can explain why you think it's acceptable to speak to your employees that way." A visible shift passed over Victor's face. His eyes flickered with something annoyance, maybe, or the creeping realization that this wasn't just another customer lodging a complaint. "I don't see how that's any of your business," he said, his voice losing some of its previous edge. The man tilted his head slightly. "Oh, I think it is." Then, with a kind of casual precision that only someone very accustomed to authority could pull off, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather card holder. With practiced ease, he flipped it open and held it up just enough for Victor and only Victor to see. Whatever was on that card drained the color from Victor's face in an instant. His arms, once crossed in defiance, slowly uncrossed. His mouth, open to deliver another sharp retort, clamped shut. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Naomi to hear the faint buzz of the espresso machine still running behind her. The man lowered the card holder and slid it back into his pocket. "Let me introduce myself," he said, his voice still calm, but now laced with unmistakable authority. "My name is Jordan Mitchell. I'm the CEO of Harbor Deli. And as of right now, I'm extremely disappointed in what I just witnessed." A collective hush fell over the cafe. Naomi felt the air shift, as if everyone in the room had simultaneously come to the realization that they had just become witnesses to something much, much bigger than a workplace argument. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it again. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. He swallowed hard, visibly scrambling to recover. "Sir, I didn't realize." Jordan held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No," he said simply. "You didn't." The authority in his voice was undeniable. It wasn't raised. It wasn't aggressive. And yet, it commanded absolute silence. Naomi, still in shock, barely registered the way Lisa's eyes darted between her and Jordan like she couldn't believe what was happening. Even David, who had been silent this whole time, looked stunned. Jordan turned to Naomi, his expression softening just slightly. "Miss Carter," he said, using her last name with a respect that caught her off guard. "I want to personally apologize for what you've had to endure here today." Naomi opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time in a long time, she was at a loss. Jordan continued, turning his gaze back to Victor. "Your behavior was not only unprofessional, but completely unacceptable. I have no intention of allowing someone like you to continue managing one of my stores." His voice didn't rise in volume, but there was a finality to his words that left zero room for negotiation. Victor looked like he had just swallowed glass. "Sir, please, if you could just—" "You're fired." The words were spoken with such absolute certainty that for a moment it was as if time itself stopped. Victor staggered back a step, blinking rapidly. "Wait, you can't." "I just did," Jordan said smoothly. "I suggest you leave now, before I have security escort you out." For the first time since he had started at Harbor Deli, Victor Barnes had nothing to say. The customers, who had been holding their breath, suddenly burst into quiet murmurs. A few exchanged glances, some even whispering in approval, and then someone started clapping. It started slow, hesitant. Then another joined in, and another, And before Naomi knew what was happening, half the cafe was applauding. Victor turned a furious shade of red, but he had no choice. With his dignity in tatters, he stormed toward the door, shoving it open so hard that the bells hanging above it rattled violently. And just like that he was gone. Naomi stood still, her breath shallow, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. And then, slowly, she turned to face Jordan Mitchell, the man who had just changed everything. For a moment, no one moved. The cafe, which had been buzzing with quiet whispers and murmured disbelief, now felt frozen in place. The only sound was the fading echo of the applause, the distant hum of the coffee machines, and the soft chime of the door closing behind Victor Barnes as he disappeared from Harbor Deli for the last time. Naomi hadn't breathed. She wasn't sure she remembered how. Her hands, which had been gripping the tray so tightly her knuckles had turned white, slowly loosened their hold. Her entire body felt like it was both on fire and ice cold at the same time, her pulse still hammering in her ears, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her with an intensity she wasn't prepared for. Victor was gone. Fired just like that, with a single command from Jordan Mitchell, the CEO. It didn't feel real. She lifted her eyes, searching for something to anchor her to the moment, and found Lisa standing beside her, looking shell-shocked, her mouth slightly open like she was still processing what had just unfolded. The younger girl's wide, brown eyes flickered between Naomi and Jordan, then back to the door as if half expecting Victor to storm back in and scream that it had all been a cruel joke. But he didn't. Across the counter, David was just as stunned, his usually calm demeanor cracked wide open with something that looked like a mix of disbelief and relief. His arms, which had been rigid at his sides during Victor's verbal assault, now slowly unfurled, his fingers flexing like he was shaking off the tension that had been holding him captive. He let out a breath sharp, uneven, the kind someone doesn't realize they've been holding for too long. And Naomi? She wasn't sure what she was feeling. She should have been relieved. She should have been thrilled that the man who had made her life a living hell was finally gone. She should have felt victorious, or at the very least vindicated. But instead, all she felt was numb. Because for the past 4 years she had learned to live with the injustice, to endure it. She had learned to stay quiet, to not make waves, to never fight back. Because fighting back meant risking everything: her job, her stability, her ability to put food on the table for Amari. And now, in the span of a few minutes, someone else had fought for her. Someone with power. Someone with authority. Someone who had just turned her entire reality upside down. Her hands trembled at her sides, but when she finally spoke, her voice came out quieter than she intended. I don't. She swallowed hard, trying to catch up with her own emotions, before her eyes found Jordan Mitchell's once more. I don't understand. Jordan's gaze softened, just slightly. It was the first time Naomi had ever seen someone look at her like that, not with pity, not with disappointment, not with indifference, but with recognition. I think you do, he said, his voice low, steady, the kind of voice that could command attention without ever needing to be raised. Naomi felt her throat tighten. She looked away, blinking rapidly, forcing herself to take one deep breath, then another. Lisa finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. Is this really happening? She looked at Jordan, her face still frozen somewhere between awe and terror. He's really fired? Jordan nodded once. Yes. Lisa let out a disbelieving laugh, a slightly hysterical edge to it, like she still wasn't convinced this wasn't some elaborate prank. She clamped a hand over her mouth, her shoulders trembling slightly, and for a second, Naomi thought she might actually cry, not out of sadness, but from the sheer weight of suppressed fear finally lifting. David, who had been silent this entire time, exhaled through his nose and shook his head slowly, his lips pressed into a tight line. I didn't think anyone would ever stand up to him, he murmured, almost to himself. Jordan studied them carefully, his dark eyes scanning their faces, as if taking inventory of just how much damage had been done before he arrived. There was something calculating in his gaze, not cold, but analytical, like he was already mentally rearranging the pieces of a broken system he had just uncovered. Let me ask you something, Jordan said, his tone thoughtful as he looked at Naomi. Was this the first time he spoke to you like that? Naomi hesitated. She should have lied. She should have said yes, acted as if this was just one bad day, as if Victor had been a decent manager and this had been an isolated incident. Because what else was she supposed to say? That she had spent years enduring his cruelty, that she had learned to take the humiliation quietly, to shield Lisa and David from the worst of it, because someone had to, that it was easier to let herself be the target than to risk making things worse. No, she should have lied. But she didn't. Naomi lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet Jordan's gaze head-on, and told him the truth. No, she said quietly, it wasn't the first time. Jordan nodded, as if he had already known the answer. He let out a slow breath, then glanced around at the cafe. The customers, though pretending to return to their conversations, were still stealing glances toward the counter, still aware that they had just witnessed something far more significant than a workplace dispute. Jordan turned back to Naomi. I thought so, he murmured. Then, after a pause, that's why I'm going to fix it. Naomi's brows furrowed slightly. Fix what? Jordan gave her a small, knowing smile. This place, he said simply, and your role in it. Her stomach twisted with something she couldn't quite name: fear, hope, disbelief, all tangled together. Jordan's gaze held hers for a long moment before he spoke again, this time with unmistakable certainty. You're not just an employee, Naomi. You're the kind of person who keeps places like this running. You train people. You protect them. You take responsibility for things that aren't even your fault, just to keep the peace. He tilted his head slightly. That's not just being a good worker. That's leadership. Naomi's breath hitched. Jordan straightened slightly, his expression turning businesslike once more. I'm not just here to fire bad managers, Miss Carter. I'm here to find the right people to lead, and I've been watching long enough to know that person is you. The room suddenly felt too small. The air too thin. Naomi shook her head, stepping back slightly. Wait. She hesitated, her heart pounding, her hands trembling before she forced herself to stop. I don't know how to do that. Jordan smiled again, but this time it was different. Not just encouraging, but confident. Certain. Yes, you do. And for the first time, Naomi wasn't so sure he was wrong. Naomi felt the room tilt beneath her feet. Her heart pounded so hard against her ribs that she wondered if everyone else could hear it. The words Jordan had just spoken, words that should have been impossible, hung in the air like a challenge, waiting for her to either accept them or run. She wasn't ready for this. She couldn't be. Could she? Lisa was the first to react. The younger girl let out an audible gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as if she had just heard someone announce the second coming of Christ. Her wide, disbelieving eyes darted between Jordan and Naomi, then back to Jordan, and for a moment it seemed like she had forgotten how to form words. David, standing just behind the counter, stared at Naomi in quiet shock, but unlike Lisa, he wasn't frozen. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but instead, he just nodded once firm, like he had just put something together in his head that had been there all along. Naomi, however, could only shake her head, her body betraying her thoughts before she could even find the words to deny it. This, she exhaled sharply, running a trembling hand through her curls, trying to grasp onto something that made sense. This is a mistake. I don't know how to be a manager. I just... Jordan didn't waver. His expression remained calm, unwavering, like he had expected her to react this way. You've been managing this place for years, Naomi, he said simply. You just didn't have the title. Naomi's stomach twisted. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, to remind him that all she had ever done was survive, keep her head down, do her job, try not to lose what little stability she had. But deep down, she knew he wasn't lying. How many times had she trained new employees because Victor refused to? How many times had she stayed late to fix scheduling mistakes he didn't care about? How many times had she smoothed over frustrated customers, protected Lisa and David, taken the blame for things that weren't even her fault, all to keep this place running? She swallowed hard, her eyes flickering to Lisa, who was now nodding furiously, as if she was trying to physically push the idea into Naomi's brain. Oh my God, Naomi, you have to do this, Lisa blurted out, her voice breathless with excitement. This is insane. This is incredible. You already know how to do everything anyway, and you actually care about us. And you don't scream at us when we make mistakes." David finally found his voice, his deep baritone steady as he spoke. "She's right," he said, his gaze locked onto Naomi's, calm but firm. "You've been leading this place since the day I started. You just didn't have the power to make it better." He tilted his head slightly. "Now you do." Naomi's breath hitched. She wanted to tell them they were wrong. That she wasn't leader material. That she wasn't strong enough. That she wasn't. A familiar voice, small but full of warmth, suddenly cut through the chaos in her head. "Mom?" Naomi turned sharply, her pulse stuttering as she saw a small figure standing near the counter, holding a plastic cup of orange juice in both hands, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Amari. Her 8-year-old daughter sat at one of the corner tables, swinging her legs beneath her chair, completely unaware of the gravity of the moment. Naomi's heart clenched. It was Saturday morning. Amari had been dropped off by Ems Reynolds, their elderly neighbor, who watched her on weekends whenever Naomi worked a long shift. It was a routine they had followed for years. Miss Reynolds would bring Amari to the cafe after breakfast, letting her do her homework at a corner booth, while Naomi finished up her shift. But today, something was different. She wasn't just waiting for her mother. She was seeing her. Lisa stepped back instinctively, giving Naomi space, but David remained still, watching quietly, understanding that this moment was bigger than all of them. Naomi crouched down, forcing herself to smile despite the war raging inside her. "Hey, baby," she said softly. "You finished your pancakes already?" Amari tilted her head, glancing at Jordan, then at Lisa, then at the sea of customers, still pretending not to eavesdrop before looking back at her mother. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine curiosity. Naomi hesitated, glancing up at Jordan, who merely raised a brow, as if to say, "Go on, tell her." She turned back to her daughter. How was she supposed to explain this? How was she supposed to tell Amari that the mother she had always known, the mother who worked double shifts, who came home exhausted, who spent nights making sure her daughter never felt the weight of their struggles, was suddenly being given something more? Something bigger. Something better. Naomi swallowed thickly, forcing herself to find the words. And then, before she could stop herself, "I got promoted." The second the words left her lips, she felt it. Something shifted. Something settled. Amari's face lit up, her tiny hands tightening around the cup of orange juice, and before Naomi could blink, she was launching herself forward, wrapping her arms around her mother's neck with all the strength her little body could manage. "That's so cool," Amari squealed, her voice filled with pure, unfiltered joy. Naomi choked on a laugh, her arms automatically wrapping around her daughter, holding on for dear life. And suddenly, just like that, everything made sense. She wasn't just taking this promotion for herself. She was taking it for Amari. For Lisa. For David. For every person in this cafe who had ever felt small, overlooked, powerless. When she finally pulled back, Amari's grin was blinding, her little hands clutching Naomi's fingers. "Does this mean we get to celebrate?" Naomi let out a breathless laugh, still half in disbelief, half in something dangerously close to hope. "Yeah, baby," she whispered. "I think it does." Lisa let out an excited whoop, practically vibrating with energy, while David just smiled, a real, genuine smile that Naomi had never seen from him before. And then Jordan, still watching silently, finally spoke. "Welcome to management, Miss Carter." Naomi looked up at him, her daughter still holding her hand, Lisa still beaming at her side, David standing steadfast as always. And this time, when she nodded, she believed it. She belonged here. She always had. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.